Okay, so now we are finally ready to test our Grasshopper component. So for that, of course, we have to click on this Start button so that Visual Studio can compile our code in the form of an assembly. But before doing that, let's just hold on for 1 second and let's take a look into the properties of our project once again. So you want to look into these build events to see what Visual Studio and to understand what Visual Studio is doing when we click on this Start button. Okay, so now let me extend this window here. So the first thing that it's going to do, and you can see it in this post build event command line. So first is taking this target path, which is basically the assembly that it's producing, the DLL assembly, and it's renaming it or copying it as a GHA file. But it's important to understand that our Grasshopper component files that you are probably used to are no other thing than DLL files or dynamic libraries, but just with this extension. And finally, Visual Studio is deleting the original DLL file. Okay, that's important. And besides that, what Visual Studio is doing, and you can see it if you come to this debug tab. So Visual Studio is going to execute Rhino, which and it's taking this, let's say this path, this directory from the extension, from the template that we chose at the beginning. Okay, so that's nice, and Visual Studio is going to execute Rhino so that we can test our component there and we can see where the errors are in case that there are any, or we can even stop the lines of our code that we want to take a closer look into. That's called the debug process. But in order to do that, of course, what we have to do is to copy the assembly into the special components folder of Grasshopper, because of course, in order for Grasshopper to access a new component, it has to be saved into that folder. So let me go to Grasshopper, and here I'm just going to get this directory of the components folder, this one, and I'm going to copy it and paste it here. So just give me 1 second. So what I want to do is to take the original assembly and I want to copy it here. And of course, I have to add another slash at the end, like that. And this is the name of my assembly. So everything looks fine. And let's test our Grasshopper component. Before that, we can close Rhino because we don't need that anymore. And we can execute Visual Studio, or our project rather. Okay, so we see now that Visual Studio is executing Rhino. And now we can launch Grasshopper. So at this point, there are two things that you have to keep in mind. The first thing is that Rhino is being executed by Visual Studio, which means that if we stop the debug process or we click on the stop button, Visual Studio is going to shut down Rhino. So if you are doing like a complex Rhino or Grasshopper definition here, keep that in mind because it's not going to be saved if you stop the process that way. And the second thing is that since we are copying our assembly into this folder of Rhino, we have to execute, let's say, Visual Studio as an administrator in case that there is a previous version of our assembly that needs to be replaced by the new one. Because otherwise, if Visual Studio has no administrator right, it might not be able to replace any previous version in this folder. Okay, so now let's get back to Rhino, or let's get to Grasshopper. And now we can see that this is this K2ing plugin. And here we can find our Tensegrity component. Perfect. And now we can see here our input parameters and our output parameters. And of course, this looks nice and so on. But what we have to do now is to create a Grasshopper definition so that we can actually test our Grasshopper component. Okay, so let's create our Grasshopper definition to test our component. And of course, we just have to provide values to provide this component with input parameters so that we can test the output. So let's go for it. So this is going to be the length of our polygon sides, that's right. And then we need the length of our strut elements, perhaps a bit longer. And then what is this? Of course, the number of levels, and this is an integer, so let's define it this way. And we also need the number of sides, another integer. Let's use, of course, 4 or 5. And we don't need the pre-stress force, because if you remember, we defined this as an optional parameter. Okay, so now we could take a look. We could take a look into the output parameters, but we can see that nothing is happening. And of course, this is some unexpected behavior, or this is no behavior at all. So what we want to do is to get back to our code and see where this problem is happening. Okay, so first, this is where we defined our pre-stress parameter as an optional parameter. And now we want to come here and to see why we are not getting any values assigned to these output parameters. So for that, we are going to debug this, let's say, script. And in order to do it, we have to, let's say, go line by line and see where the error is. So if we click here on this lateral bar, we see this red circle, which means that Visual Studio is going to stop when it comes to this line. So in order to run our component again, we just need to plug this slide, one of the slides or input parameters again. And yes, we can see that Visual Studio is stopping here, and we can see step by step what is happening. So if we press, let's say, the key F10, we can move on. Okay, so now we can see that, okay, the variables are being initialized, that's right. And if you come here, and of course I made this error in purpose, if you come here and we click F10, it returns. So it doesn't assign any value into this variable, but let's say the method finalizes. So in order to completely finalize the program, let's let it run till the end. So we could just either click on continue or click on F5, sorry. Yes, of course I made this error on purpose, but the thing is that I forgot to write this, sorry, of course I cannot modify my component now, my code now, so let's stop this, and again, when I stop it, I'm going to close Rhino and Grasshopper, so I will have to start the Grasshopper definition from scratch. But let's assume that that's okay for me. So I've just stopped it, no Rhino, no Grasshopper anymore, and now I can edit it, because what I want to do is to stop the program if I'm not providing any input parameter. But what I was doing is to stop the program if I was actually providing some input parameter, which of course was the opposite that I wanted to do. And we can compile our component again and test it. Okay, so let's start from scratch once again. This is our Tensegrity component, and let's define the sliders. Okay, and now we can take a look here, and we can see that there is actually some up output here. And if we go to Rhino, we can see, and this is great, that yes, this is our Tensegrity structure, which looks really nice. So we can see our struts here, our cables, our supports, and everything. So let's play a bit with this kind of Grasshopper definition. So of course we can make the polygon bigger, but if we do it too big in this point, we can see that strut elements need to be longer. So that's the, let's say, the checkpoint that we set in our Visual Studio. And this means that our square root would be negative. So the content would be a negative value. So that's what is happening. And of course we can add different levels and so on and so forth. And yes, we can also create, we can create Tensegrity structures with polygons of more sides, like this kind of square Tensegrity structure, or with even more sides. Okay, so this is our geometrical definition of Tensegrity structures.